Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to do something a little bit different and, honestly, pretty fascinating. We are diving into the foundational cultural building blocks of the United States, but we're doing it by tracking the journey of two very specific things side by side: what people were reading and what they were eating. You know, culture isn't just about what happens in government buildings or on battlefields. It's actually right there in the pantry and on the bookshelf. So let's jump right in and see exactly how American identity was forged both on the page and on the plate. Here's a quick look at our roadmap. We'll start with Native American roots, move through colonial adaptation, hit the era of independence, explore the massive 19th century shift, navigate modernism and mass production, and finally wrap up with contemporary American culture. To get our bearings, think about this massive sweep of history, leaping all the way from the pre-1600s right up to the 1950s. We're talking about one of the most radical transformations in human daily life ever. We are going to synthesize these two cultural lenses era by era so you can see exactly how American food and writing evolved together from hyperlocal, land-based survival all the way to a highly industrialized modern society. All right, let's start at the very beginning with Section 1, Native American Roots and Traditions. Long before European arrival, Native American literature and diets were completely anchored in specific local biomes. It was all about the visceral realities of survival. Tribes across the continent relied on this brilliant agricultural system known as the Three Sisters, which is corn, beans, and squash grown together. From there, protein was dictated entirely by geography. Out in the plains and forests, you had deer, elk, and bison. But down in the subtropical swamps of the south, tribes like the Choctaw were literally hunting snapping turtles and young alligators. And up on the East Coast, native peoples were pioneering the New England clam bake, using this genius technique of stone boiling, where they'd layer heated rocks with seaweed to steam local seafood. Everything was just deeply, inherently local. And what's really amazing is that those exact same natural survival rhythms were directly mirrored in their literature. Their rich oral traditions, creation myths, and folk tales frequently relied on culturally significant numbers drawn straight from nature. So, for example, incidents and stories were often repeated in floors, representing the four cardinal directions, or they'd use sevens, which added skyward, earthward, and center. Their stories literally mapped out their physical relationship to the earth. Moving on to Section 2, Colonial Adaptation and Survival. So the 1600s and 1700s bring this massive collision of the old and new worlds, forcing European settlers to dramatically adapt to the American landscape. And what people ate and wrote quickly splintered by region. Up in the northern colonies, brutal winters meant they couldn't rely on year-round farming, so they focused heavily on hunting game and coastal seafood. Mentally and spiritually, they were equally rigid, leaning hard into strict Puritan religious writings. Think of ministers like Increase Mather. But down in the southern colonies, it was a totally different story. The climate allowed for year-round, highly diverse agriculture, and their early writings reflected that boots-on-the-ground reality, favoring super practical, day-to-day survival accounts of colonial life, like the ones famously penned by John Smith. But hey, don't let all this adaptation fool you. Even though they were learning to farm local crops like corn instead of their beloved wheat, colonists initially clung tightly to British traditions. This mindset is perfectly captured by Hannah Glasse. In 1747, she published an incredibly popular English cookbook that was everywhere in the colonies, and she totally rejected outside culinary influences. She actually dismissed French cooking as an odd jumble of trash. It's hilarious, but it proves a crucial point. The ingredients might have been new, but the colonial mindset was desperately trying to remain European. Let's jump into Section 3, Independence and Expanding Frontiers. By the late 1700s, America is pushing toward independence and expanding its frontiers, which fundamentally shifted both the pantry and the publications. The political revolution sparked a literary one. Right alongside famous political texts by guys like Thomas Paine, we see the birth of purely American fiction. In 1789, William Hill Brown published The Power of Sympathy, which is widely recognized as the very first American novel. But here's the fascinating part. This wasn't just beach reading. It was a deliberate cautionary tale advocating for rational thinking and moral education. It explored the exact virtues they thought were needed to build a brand new independent nation. And that literary independence ran right alongside culinary independence. We enter the era of the incredibly self-sufficient 19th century farmhouse diet. Rural families survived on staples like Johnny Cakes, which was a flatbread made from cornmeal because wheat was still really tough to get. They relied heavily on canned and preserved vegetables to make it through the winter. They pressed fresh apples into cider for fermentation and boiled them down into apple butter. Oh, and almost everything was cooked in rendered pork fat. This was a diet of profound self-reliance, literally pulled from the dirt they stood on. Which brings us to Section 4, the 19th century shift. As the nation matured between the 1820s and 1850s, distinct American intellectual and cultural identities firmly took root. We actually see a massive ideological split in American literature that directly mirrored the dual reality of American life at the time. On one side, you have Transcendentalism. Think of Henry David Thoreau's Walden. This was an intellectual movement built on the optimistic belief in the inherent goodness of people, nature, and total self-reliance. It perfectly matched the physical reality of that agrarian farmhouse survival we just talked about. But on the flip side, you have the American Gothic movement. Writers like Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne were driven by a deep frontier anxiety. To them, the wilderness wasn't just a place to grow corn, it was terrifying and full of the unknown, and their stories are just dripping with dark, decaying themes.
Section 5. Modernism and Mass Production.
The trauma of the Civil War and World War I, combined with massive technological leaps, violently disrupted those old agrarian ways of life. Science completely revolutionized how Americans ate. First, we get milking machines and pasteurization, making urban milk supplies safe. Then, in the 1920s and 30s, scientists started fortifying foods, famously adding vitamin D to milk. Next came advanced refrigeration and a heavy reliance on factory canned goods. And finally, post-World War II, we hit the absolute peak of convenience. The flash-frozen TV dinner completely left the organic family farm behind in favor of a highly processed, industrialized system. So, faced with this rapidly changing, much less organic world, and deeply scarred by the trauma of global conflict, we really have to ask, how did American authors adapt their storytelling to make sense of it all?
Well, they adapted by completely dropping the romanticism of the past. First, literature moved toward realism. Authors like Mark Twain used vigorous, colloquial language to depict the world plainly, exactly as it was, with no supernatural elements. And then, following the horrific shock of World War I, we get American modernism, the famed lost generation of expatriate writers, people you definitely know, like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, began exploring profound themes of pain, skepticism, and this loss of direction their generation felt in this mechanized era. The literature became as stark and processed as the era itself.
Finally, Section 6, Contemporary American Culture. From the 1950s onward, America transformed into a hyper-convenient, highly diverse postmodern society. And thank goodness for global immigration, because it essentially saved the American palate from becoming entirely mass-produced and bland. German immigrants brought urban delicatessens, cold cuts, and potato salads to cities. Eastern European Jewish immigrants took those same deli spaces and introduced corned beef, pastrami, and rich kosher traditions. The forced migration of Africans centuries earlier had already laid the incredibly deep foundations of soul food, with ingredients like yams and peanuts. And Spanish and Mexican influences gave rise to amazing regional fusions like Tex-Mex and New Mexican cuisine. Our modern diet became this wonderfully pluralistic melting pot. And at the exact same time our food was becoming this diverse fusion, our literature absolutely exploded into postmodernism. Starting with the countercultural Beat generation in the 1950s, writers started using subversive themes to critique this incredibly fast-paced pluralistic society. They completely threw out the old rulebooks. They began using temporal distortion, wildly unreliable narrators, and deep, self-conscious critiques of American culture. They were trying to process a world where everything, from the food we eat to the media we consume, was suddenly available all the time, everywhere. Ultimately, American culture is a constant, ongoing synthesis of what we physically and mentally consume. From Native American Three Sisters agriculture and creation myths, all the way to frozen TV dinners and postmodern novels, we literally are what we eat, and we are what we read. So I want to leave you with this thought today. Go look at your own pantry and your own bookshelf right now. How do the daily foods you eat and the modern stories you read reflect your specific place in this centuries-long journey? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.